Hello, EconBuff podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today is Dr. Harry Hueston. Harry is a recently retired professor of criminal justice. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
He retired as the chief of police from the University of Arizona in 2000 after 30 years in law enforcement, serving in various positions in Ohio, California, Arizona, and the U.S. Army Military Police. He's currently certified as a police officer in Ohio, Arizona, and the U.S. Army. Harry, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited today. We're going to talk about serial killers. So I got to start off with a bit of a trigger warning. Never had to do this on the pod before. So if you would be bothered by such things, just be aware. We're going to talk about serial killers today and all things that attend them. We're going to try to be judicious about how we do it, but we're here to have a good and thorough discussion as well. So if you're listening and that bothers you, this may not be the episode for you. If you're listening and there's small children in the room, maybe send them away. I don't know. So Harry, start us off. What is a serial killer?
Well, a serial killer has been defined as a person who kills more than 3 people over a period of time. That definition is not mine. It's basically how the FBI and some other criminal justice agencies define it. The issue there is somebody who goes into a location and shoots and kills 3 people on the same day, only in 3 hours. Is that a serial killer? No, that's a mass shooter.
Mass shooter, right.
So the definition of a serial killer is an individual who is killing people over a period of time. Generally, as you have seen, some of these serial killers have been killing people for decades. And that's part of the issue when you're dealing with this type of a criminal on decades of bodies and how do you collect evidence, and it's a complex case investigation, and but they're alive and well, and they're walking around right now in our country.
So you're starting us off by scaring us already. You kind of anticipated my follow-up to that was talk about the difference between mass shooters and serial killers. So I think there's kind of a third category about like spree killings, or I don't know if you categorize a killer as that.
Yeah.
So a mass shooter kind of evokes this. There's one time and one instance, and then that's kind of it, right?
Yep.
And there's some fairly high-profile cases of that even recently, Sandy Hook, and then of course you got Aurora, Colorado, and stuff like that. So in those situations, you get a mass killer, and they're killing multiple people at one time. It's kind of like an event.
Yep.
You got serial killers, and that evokes this like Ted Bundy kind of thing, where people are killing over, you said decades. I mean,
decades.
there are some crazy cases like that. And then, a lot of your like mysterious type of killings people can suspect that that's part of like an unidentified serial killer, which I really want to talk about that aspect in a minute. But talk to us just a little bit about how you would differentiate. Do we have the right feel if we're thinking about that kind of stalkerish, mentally unhealthy person with a serial killer, or are there maybe some other types maybe?
Well, a lot of that boils down to the person that is doing the killing. And this is where you'll find there are going to be a whole diverse a rationale as to, are we going to target this group and why? Or are we going to do this group and why? And what drives it? And how do they, some of the questions are, how do they live with themselves? And then, so in my mind, a serial killer investigation is one of the toughest because the length of time involved, the victims that are involved, the lack of any type of solid good evidence, and then the fact that it's not in one location. Many serial killers, like I said, are roaming the United States right now. In fact, the estimate was, you're going to go a little crazy with this, but the FBI is estimating between 3,000 and 5,000.
No. Are you serious? Current active?
Yeah, I believe that that's right. And the reason
Okay, but if you'd have asked me, Lee, guess how many? I'd have been like, I don't know, 3 or 5? And you're saying I'm off by
many more.
Multiple orders of magnitude.
Multiple orders, multiple locations. unknown victims, totally unknown victims.
So,
And,
do you have a sense of like how many like unsolved murders there are
well, let me give you an
in a
example.
year or something like that?
Let me give you an example. When I was a police chief in Arizona, every month I received a book that was put out by the Department of Justice, and the purpose of the book was to put it out there to all police departments across the country to see if they could identify, was this a missing person in your area, or this characteristic and stuff like that. And the problem that we had is there were over 200 to 300 pictures, and that was for 1 month. So to give you an idea on the magnitude, this is one of those crimes we really don't have a good idea. And that's what makes some of these serial killers, most recently, the integration of DNA. And you get a guy like Little or this guy Nick. Oh, and I will tell you, I would say that the use of DNA in bringing out cold cases, and I'm talking cold cases, I'm talking 20, 30, 40, and 50 years ago, where they gathered this evidence, the concept of DNA wasn't really there for the street cop, but now see where we are and how it's being used. I think you're going to see a resurrection of these cases coming up, and if they have the evidence, if they have that DNA, they're going to start, and you're going to see more of these cases. But you look at the age of these individuals that they're getting, they are not 30 or 40. I mean, they're into their late 60s, 70s, 80s, and that's what I think we're going to see in the future.
So that brings up an aside. I don't want to get derailed because I do want to come back around to those two numbers you mentioned. But in the case of these people that they're finding that are 60, 70 years old, they're bringing. You're talking about the killers themselves.
Yeah,
in that
the
case.
killers. Mhm.
So they haven't been doing that at that whole time. So at some point they stop. Like that's a puzzle to me.
And that's a great question. I don't know if I would say they stop. Indications are, people like a Bundy. Well, he got caught. He
Right.
didn't stop. Let's take the Zodiac Killer, for example. They haven't caught this guy. They just broke his code recently, which I find is fascinating because it wasn't like 2 years ago. It was decades ago. And look who did it. A bunch of private citizens
Right.
at a think tank cracked it. Well, but they haven't caught the guy. And so it's, to me, this is a new growing field that needs to be researched again. And to say they stop, BTK, bind, torture, kill. That guy, Radner, I'm here to tell you, he missed the fame that he got. And so there's a lot of that stuff inside that they're so, their names they watch and they get excited seeing their name all over the place. And then when that disappears, they go through a drought. Then they want to resurrect it again. So that's what Radner did. He started poking the, as I call it, he started throwing the stuff out and the cops were on it and got him. So to say they quit, some of them do. Some of them keep right on killing. Dahmer kept on killing until he was caught. Gacy, I mean, he kept killing until he was caught. So it really, there's no one size fits all, I guess.
So we've touched on several things because I'm going to want to talk about motivation. I'm going to want to talk about investigation. I'm going to want to talk about, should we make these into high-profile cases? Because then that creates kind of an endogeneity problem. We're sort of feeding the monster.
Yep.
That leaves room for copycats. So there's a bunch of ways we can go. And before we I really don't want to let this thread get away. How can it be that there are hundreds of missing people across the country every month? Like, for somebody like me who's living my like quiet suburban
Mhm.
life, it doesn't. Only the smallest, piddliest of crime. I had a car that was parked on the street. I forgot to lock. Somebody like obviously went through it, see if they could get anything of
Mhm.
value. There's nothing in it, so they didn't. So like that's crime. But I understand why that doesn't get reported, and I understand why some more heinous things, where you have other factors like rape. I understand why victims aren't going to come forward. But I'm not ashamed to report that my window was
Sure.
broken. So it seems like we'd have a good catalog on that. And then the missing people thing is just like really weird to me. How many people are up and moving across the country and not telling them when they get registered as a missing person, but they're fine. They're just chasing their dreams to be an actor in LA. How do you have that volume of missing people? Or could we be talking, even, for example, a missing person, it could be an accident, right? I could have gone hiking up in the hills and gone missing, but then there are people here that would be like, well, Lee went hiking a week ago. You probably should have been back for class this morning, right? So how do you even
Well-
talk to us as those regular citizens who can't even fathom how there could be that many missing people?
Well, everything that you mentioned, you have somebody that cares enough for you to report you missing. What if I told you there's thousands of people, they're throwaway people? Throwaway, let me define that. These will be prostitutes, runaways, homeless, and that idea that somebody cares about them doesn't exist. And the idea, when you look, if you look at the interviews that are done with these serial killers, what do they do with the bodies? Well, I don't know. I just threw it over the hill. There's a heck of a lot of geography where we may find those bodies. And you know what? We may not. Why? Because animals eat bodies. And so that's why there's a number of examples over in Albuquerque where the couple's out hiking and their dog comes back with a bone, and they look, and it's a human hand.
Yeah, that sounds like an episode of a crime drama, right?
Well, all of the crime, mind hunters, and all the rest of these things that are evolving. When you take a look at the interviews or the interrogations that are done on those known serial killers that have either been arrested and then executed, or awaiting trial, or are in prison for life, you'll find that there's so many they can't remember. And this guy Little is drawing pictures. He said, "Well, we had this one," and he is one of the few they think that may have killed over 100, and it's mind-boggling. Yet he is able to at least present himself in remembering, and has created a whole portrait of his victims, which is sort of mind-boggling to me, because there's not one or two or 15 or 20. He's up to about 100 to 104. And here's the other thing. There may be more. How do you validate all this? Right. Bundy said he killed hundreds. Well, how do you validate? I mean, where do you go? And does he remember? And again, we're talking about an individual that has no conscience in killing somebody. In fact, has actually enjoys it and looks forward to that. Well, come on. Most of us aren't wired that way. And so, and then the other thing is, most of us, we remember things, particularly important things. The serial killer, big deal. So I killed this one. So what? I dumped that body over there. Nobody's going to find it. And he is absolutely correct. This is a big country. And so we are not finding bodies. And like you said, it's hard to fathom. But if you have nobody that cares, it's not hard to fathom at all. They call it the throwaway people.
So we sort of have this idea, about serial killers. I think even, casual people that are thinking about this casually, just conversation that comes up, we probably do have some sense that it's often these type of people that are victims, and that's why. And so it's probably especially heinous when we have a serial killer who's not focused on those type of people, who's not killing for this, or maybe they get some kind of perverse enjoyment out of, well, obviously all of it's perverse, enjoyment out of specifically targeting people who do have connections, right? But then my guess, those serial killers, they don't evade being caught quite as long because that creates a much bigger trail and intensity of desire to find them, right?
Right. It's again, that's, for example, Gacy. He killed kids. And what brought the attention to Gacy over a period of time was when he killed his last kid. The cops were on it right there. And the cops had tied this kid was seen with this last person. And that last person was Gacy, and boom. Dahmer, for example, the guy escaped. And when the guy escaped from Dahmer and got the cops, and the cops went up there, wow. And then they looked and they started seeing pictures of dismembered bodies, and that was it. He was had right there.
Yeah.
And so sometimes these things occur where this individual has been killing for a long period of time, and one incident takes all that attention that the cops don't have a clue because there's nobody, it's no witnesses, no evidence, no nothing, and all of a sudden it comes, and then it all comes together. Sometimes that's the way it works. Other times they get away with it forever.
So that last point is very interesting, but one of the things that you said, I had done some reading, and the name is escaping me, but the really famous serial killer and somebody that had actually attacked people in Toronto, and I was just struck when I read that story. I don't know why the name's escaping me. I was struck when I read that story how many close calls there were.
Oh, yeah.
Where literally they're interviewing this person in prison, and the person goes, "Yep, I was here," and it kind of in both directions, right? And I was like, well, I was gonna grab this lady, but she stepped on the train, she got away. And then another time, I had just done this, and a policeman walked by 10 seconds, later, and I was able to hide. And then some of this stuff is just ridiculous, right? They're literally right there in the police's grasp, but what can you expect the policeman to do? He doesn't know that this is the person, and if he'd have showed up 10 seconds earlier, he would have seen the harassment, he'd have seen him in the act, he'd have caught him,
right?
And that story would have been very different, and it almost would have, prevented all these other number of things. So, and then you said, well, how many of them get? Obviously, really hard to estimate given the type of numbers we've already talked about.
Yes.
So, is it safe to say the number that are in the sort of our social knowledge here, the Dahmers and the Gacy's, and that we know about, represent potentially a very small fraction of total of serial killers?
That is a very good question that I wish I could give an answer that you want. I can't.
Of course.
Because when you look at these individuals, we've caught a lot, but when you look at the victims involved and all that, I can't tell you, do we keep 10%? Or how about 20? Maybe we're at 25. And the answer to that is, we don't know.
Yeah. But I'm going to have trouble sleeping tonight because I'm guessing the number isn't 99% of them.
No. I don't think we're getting... It's because the numbers of victims and the way and how we find them. I mean, look at Long Beach. Long Beach in New York. There's a guy. They've got guys that are dumping bodies out there over decades. They haven't caught him. They know who he's dumping, but they haven't him. I'm assuming because most serial killers are white males. They haven't found him, and we're talking decades. They got there's one in Louisiana. They haven't caught him. They got one on I-40. They call him the I-40 guy. I mean, you can look at various parts of our country, and there are serial killers out there working, and they're assigned these names by either their location, like this, you know, the Interstate 40 serial killer. Why? Because he targets individuals on I-40. And so the names come up, made up by either media or somebody, and the police they're at the end of the road. And what I mean by that is they're first got to try to identify who the heck they're dealing with, and then putting that person's life, if they can find who that is, you know, we're here, what happened before that. Now, there's another thing you need to know, Vicap, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. This is a nationwide program put out by the FBI, and its purpose there is when a police investigator or police officer finds a body, nothing on it, nothing. They can enter the body, where it was, male, female, characteristics, ethnicity, and all this stuff. They get an age, the cause of death. They enter that into a national database. And that was put together because we find that there was no national database anywhere. And so that has, in some ways, contributed to catching some of these people, because they find a body that was killed this way outside of Tucson, Arizona. They find a similar body killed that way down in St. Angelo. Well, they find another body similar to that over at St. Louis. And so when they see certain patterns, ethnicity, gender, profession, prostitution is really, in my mind, one of the bigger victims in this. And then the methodology of death, strangulation, killing, decapitation, this part missing, that part, trophies taken, whatever. Then when you get that on a national level and you start looking at that, that's another way that you believe you're dealing with yet another serial killer, because they tend to create, in their killing, they kill the same way. They may stage the bodies, they may take parts of the bodies, but their methodology in killing victims, they may be like Bundy. You know, he was looking for white females with a certain type of hair that was parted in the middle that reminded him of his girlfriend that broke up with him. Mm-hmm. And so, welcome to, you know, what an individual sees in another person that killed them. That's what serial killers are going to do.
So let's talk about the methodology really quickly then. You can sort of understand, I think motivation of serial killers is like a real puzzle to us.
Big puzzle.
You know, but we're told these stories as to they're looking for a type, and that type might be a physical type, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. It might be, like you said, an occupation. It might just be the fact that nobody would miss them. There's several things at play there. Why the consistency seemingly in the way that they would kidnap and then eventually kill their victims? Mm-hmm. Like, why is somebody that I can almost, in a, again, perverse way, kind of see why things that we would think as like tied to an emotional thing. If you're have this girlfriend that broke up with you, and then you find a girl that sort of sufficiently fits that body type, and then you strangle her. Like you can see the thread that's going mm-hmm. through that person's mind. But other things like trophies or strangulation, or not strangulation, but like you said, decapitation. Like, what's happening there? Is the killer discovering that that's an effective way to do it? And so why experiment with these kind of things when you found something that gets the job done? Is that something that is directly a part of what is the thrill to them? Like, I remember reading a story about what I think an axe murderer in Louisiana, mm-hmm. right? But maybe if that guy goes and stabs someone with a knife, it doesn't do anything for him. Mm-hmm. He's not going to enjoy shooting someone, right? It's got to be this sort of particular. And some of those things are really visceral, and so you can understand if you're that kind of demented person, why that would be a certain payoff. And other ones don't seem to be that kind of thing. Can you speak briefly to just sort of the methodology, maybe of kidnapping as well, but the killing?
Yeah. Well, you got to understand, serial killers are going to evolve. Their first kill, there's a rush, and they've continually talked about a rush that they get, and then the power in their hands when they're strangling somebody. That's what Little did. But the idea that they're gonna their first kill is going to set some patterns into place. And what I mean by that is who and whatever and how it is done, that's going to set them, they're comfortable, and they get more comfortable as they expand their victims. And so if we look at the serial killers, like Bundy would use a ruse. He would, my hand is broken, come and help me here. And that was, he would get the victims, he used a sympathy ploy. A lot of them, simply get and I will say, not again, a prostitute, and under the guise that they're going to make money for some sexual act, and they get in a car and they get isolated and then they're killed. And so a lot of that is going to be based upon what that individual serial killer feels most comfortable in taking that life. But once that first one's initiated, that's it. They're going. And they will use the same basic methodology. They may expand it as they become more proficient. Some of them will take their victims and not kill them right away. They'll rape them, they'll beat them, and they'll do this repeatedly over months and then finally kill them. It's those areas, there's no, the only consistent thing there is the death. The rest of the stuff is predicated upon the preference of the serial killer. And that, the death is the only consistent thing. Anything else, cannibalism, that's what Dahmer would do. And some of these guys are bizarre in what they try to think they can do, create zombies or stuff like that. So that's what makes it so hard to investigate and catch, and it's a pretty complex crime that the only consistent thing there is somebody's dead. How they died, or was, and how it was done, and was it done quickly or was it over a period of time? Flip the coin. Not there.
So the other consistency often is geography. So I've read some of these stories as well, where when a killer has a close call, they might switch geographies, and those are often the ones that manage to evade us of being captured for a long time.
Right.
So the ones that have a smaller geographic region are more likely to stay in that, seem to be more likely to be caught. Would you comment sort of briefly on their choice of geography, and then how committed they might be to that geography?
Yeah. Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at this guy, Gary Ridgeway, Green River Killer, alive and well when I was as a chief. And that was name given to him because that's where victims were found. But if you look in the study of Ridgeway, he basically said every place where he buried a body is where he and one of his wives had gone out and had sex, and he felt comfortable there. And so the river, or the Green River, well, okay, so he buried a number of them, just left them there, didn't necessarily bury them. Other places, when he was eventually caught, The women that were married to him were interviewed by the cops and say, yeah, we camped there and we had sex there. So he buried a number of bodies there. And so it's bizarre how the rationale of the site. But obviously, if let's take this Long Island serial killer, he's up to I think 14 or 15 or 20. Well, there's something about that site that's isolated enough that he feels he can take a body, bury it, and get away. He's comfortable. And you're right, they will stay in a comfortable area until they feel, well, wait a second, the cops don't know, but I got to find another place. And they'll go find another place. And so it's tough. It's a very complex crime to wrap around and get. And because of the geography, we have cars. And so the mobility issue of taking a body, put in a car, driving 300 miles, dumping it someplace. And some of these cases, it's how did you come up with this place? Well, I was just driving by. It was isolated, just did it. I mean, there's no consciousness about it. It's there, boom, throw the body out there. Let the body roll down the bottom of a mountain or a cliff or something, and who's going to find it? Well, chances are it's not going to be found. It's going to be eaten. And so another complexity to the whole thing.
Well, so we've discussed this idea of isolated, and we're thinking. You said Tucson, right? So we're thinking about deserts, or we're thinking about cliffsides, or thinking about mountains. I have to imagine that there's just an enormity of bodies that are never going to be found that are related to waterways, right? Like, I mean, this is even one of the things that's kind of like the mafia story, right? Like, how many people are in the East River or the Hudson, and serial killers have to be thinking about that kind of thing too, and the type of animals and vultures or whatever they're going to eat bodies into, they're probably outnumbered 10-1 by things that'll eat you in the water, in that sort of scenario. I don't know of any cases off the top of my head, so I'm speculating here, but are there some instances of that?
Well, you mentioned geography. What about the bodies that are eaten? I mean, you had a guy in Texas that was feeding his victims to the pigs.
Right.
And it's one of these things, Lee, that I really don't know if we're going to find a good answer to. Some of these are just the opportunity. There's an isolated area, dump it and go. Some of these are familiar, a familiar dumping ground, and then they change, and sometimes the serial killer wants the body to be found, so that'll hype up their self and their self-esteem, because they found this individual who was posed this way. And again, that's the mindset of the serial killer. It's just this is what makes it so tough.
So it's good that we circled back around to that. That's another topic that I was wanting to sort of cover. How do you approach that from the mindset of, this is something people are interested in? I mean, go look at your Netflix account. There's a bunch of serial killer documentaries on there, and it fascinates us. And just 99.99% of us are like, we just can't even fathom that. We can't fathom killing someone, let alone going on a serial killer spree. How do you balance that with more high profile, probably does raise the kind of awareness that's going to help the police actually be able to catch somebody in this case, versus you're also potentially feeding someone's ego and actually providing motivation to do that? Is sort of akin to the we don't negotiate with terrorists kind of thing, because you don't encourage that kind of behavior. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a better way to go about it, or it just kind of is what it is?
Well, again, when you look at this from an investigative standpoint, I think in my career, I may have had to deal with one in the 30 years that I was involved in law enforcement. But when you look at how law enforcement, they're going to deal with one minute part of a very long and complex puzzle. That one minute part may be they found a victim, and they found this victim in this condition at this location. And they're going to do everything they can to collect all the evidence they possibly can, and then hopefully they'll be able to get some sort of an identification on that victim. And then if that identification leads to somebody that's in the area, then that's their starting point. But like I told you before, that might not even exist. You don't have flesh. You'd have a bone that appears to be from a individual of this gender and this ethnicity and this age. So you have a dead body, but the only thing left is, let's say, your femur or an ankle bone. And so think about the frustration the cops are going to have with that. That body they found, for example, may have been dumped there for years. The body can decompose and quite rapidly, but within 6 to 9 months, that's it. I mean, if it's outside, the animals are going to eat it, scattered all over the place, and you may be lucky to find a skull. But between the animals and the insects, nothing much left other than the bones.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge level of frustration involved with that. And so, like I mentioned, that Vicap, they put what they got into that, and you're one step closer to the next million steps that you have to take in identifying. You've got a serial killer, but you've got a million steps between that and quote an ID on a particular person. So it's very frustrating, very tough, very complex. And imagine, let's take an example, Little Canyon, Texas. Canyon, Texas. If one of their police officers was out someplace, and do we have remote locations? And the answer is yeah. Excuse me. So if you go out there and they find a part of a body, well, what's going to happen? Exactly what I just explained to you. Bone. Identify the bone. Appears to be from a female, appears to be Caucasian, appears to be between the ages of 25 to 38 or 40. Okay, and the doctor and the anthropologist, they can tell you all that stuff. Well, what do you got from there? Welcome to serial killers and their investigation.
Now you go look at the giant book of missing people over the last 10 years and
sure,
beat your head against the wall for hours. Who knows?
That's it.
So let's just kind of a passing thought that you had said, because we've mentioned just several places, and are there trends in the type of places or geography that we see serial killers? My intuition is they're somewhat well spread out. They're just as likely to happen anywhere as anywhere else. Or are we likely to see them in big cities or in colder climates or in rural areas? What do you?
I think they're spread out, and I don't think they can be anywhere at any time. And like I said, the media will create a name. The Green River Killer, why? For the bodies. The I-40 Killer, why? I-40. And so depending upon the geography or the geographical location of where a number of bodies are found, the Long Island serial killer, be anywhere, any place, anytime.
The other thing that you mentioned earlier was you tend to see a high disproportion of white male serial killers. Right. I think it's a pretty well-known fact. But it crossed my mind when you said that. We're obviously telling an American-centric story, or especially a European and American-centric story. Do we see serial killers in general in sort of, the non-Europe,
Yep.
the non-United States
Oh,
area?
yeah.
And in those cases, what are the characteristics of those killers?
Well, I will tell you that serial killers come on both genders.
That's news to some people, right?
Sir?
That's news to some people, right?
Yeah. I mean, women, there's some serious serial killers that women did over in Europe.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah. And
I was under the. I mean, I couldn't even think of the name of any particular female serial killer.
well, there's been a couple sisters that were actually, I think it was the Womble sisters. I could be wrong in the pronunciation of that. But serial killers can be found in basically any ethnic group, any gender, and any age. There are serial killers in Russia. A serial killer that claimed to kill over 145 was associated with the game of chess. Serial killer down in South America. He would kill little girls. He was in Peru, and then they put him in jail. He got out, went to Bolivia. They put him in jail. He got out. And so ethnicity, gender, age, any one of those. If you do research on serial killers, they're all there.
That's just unbelievable to me. So I want to talk about the investigative techniques. You've done a good job talking about databases and DNA and different things and how that ought to progress. But I did want to circle back around to, you mentioned private individuals cracking the Zodiac code. Are you familiar with the Netflix documentary Don't Fuck with Cats? So
Nope.
There's a story of a guy. He puts up a video. Obviously, it couldn't have been YouTube, but some sort of streaming service.
Mhm.
And he's killed 2 cats and he's put them in a bag and he throws them in the dumpster. And it's like, that's more or less, I think, the entirety. And it creates a group of people who are very upset by this.
Sure.
And they start to they form a group and they start to investigate, and that kind of eggs this killer on. And so now there are more explicit videos where he's supposedly feeding one to an anaconda, and then he's playing with a cat, and then later on he's got a picture of him
Sure.
disposing of the cat and so on. And this then escalates into a case where I can't remember if the serial killer in this case is gay or he's just attracting gay prostitutes or gay people and then ending up killing them. And so the story, though, is all these people that are investigating it. We saw them in this time, and we see this picture in the background of that, and going through. And in some ways, those private groups probably have time and resources that a police department's just not going to have. I can't fixate on this one video of an individual and be like, okay, that dumpster looks like the type of dumpsters that go behind McDonald's. Like, you just can't. I guess you could, but it seems unlikely that you could actually do that. Do you see that is that a one-off story that I'm seeing because it made for good drama on Netflix, or are we actually seeing individuals involved in these kind of serial crimes investigation?
Well, I think a lot of that is social media and generates this, and somebody takes this idea, which I think is deplorable, and makes a movie out of that. Well, welcome to our country today. And by the way, it's not only in our country. I think it's worldwide, because there's enough of these things out there as you can find. Now, one of the things you said, if once cats, dogs, those kind of things, the killing of that, well, that's very offensive. I'm a dog person. That would get me upset. And there are laws against that. And, if the police felt that was a priority that they could look at, they pull it up and they would investigate. Police are solving hundreds of crimes right now because of social media. But I think the idea, when you start killing a person on social media, cops are going to be all over that. And the cops are doing that, by the way, right now, in solving a number of crime, particularly if there's an indication that a person has been killed. It's like rape. We've had numerous incidences where some of our students in a variety of colleges or high schools across our country will give a female a drug that totally knocks her out and then proceed to gang rape her and take pictures of it. Well, I can tell you right now, those pictures and the cops are going to be on that, and they will catch those individuals. Classic example is, look at the riot in Washington, D.C. Look at the extensive use of social media by the FBI and the results, okay? And welcome to the reality of social media today in investigations. I'm here to tell you, if you put it on the air and it's a crime, you're gonna get caught, and you're just seeing that unfold right now.
Just as sort of an aside, we're sort of ultimately fascinated with serial killers, but you're going to have other types of serial crime. You mentioned rape. I think there'd be serial rapists in a way that are targeting people, and a part of that, and then they're sort of relying on some of those things we talked about, like there's a dramatic underreporting of rape because it carries other connotations that the victim doesn't want to deal with.
Right.
I think we can all sympathize with that. But those sort of share investigative similarities, I would think.
Yes.
Except that there's no body at the end.
Right.
Right. Because you get the serial killer, as unlikely as it is in some cases, if they want the body to not be found, that it's not.
Absolutely correct. And again, many of the serial killers use rape as part of that process. And some of them actually go back to a body that has been dead for a number of days and have sex with dead bodies. And that's the mindset that is evident.
That's part of the Bundy case, right?
Bundy did that, but again, Bundy was one, but Ridgeway was another. When you start digging around, you start researching these individuals, it's pretty ghastly what they did.
So how much of the type of stories that we are familiar with end up being the story part built on testimony from these people, and how much of that is unsubstantiated, that you think is probably fanciful? So we sort of build up this myth around these characters. You say, well, they obviously did bad things, and they probably really are serial killers. There are bodies that we found, and we matched them to that, and so on. But you hear these cases where somebody will claim, they killed 2 people, but they claim 20 bodies, that kind of thing. And so there's a perverse rationality there, right? Which is, if you're going down for 2 murders, why not make yourself into the legend that's going to have stories told about you and have 20 murders? How much of that do you think is probably something we ought to at least take with a grain of salt?
Well, the police don't take it with a grain of salt. I mean, if somebody comes up and claims they've killed so many, the police have a responsibility to the families of these victims to validate that. And so you will see in countless examples of the police interviewing and then taking these serial killers. Okay, you killed somebody here. Show me where. And by golly, that's how they validate it. They find the body. They find the grave. They validate this. So
what happens when somebody goes to tell you that story and they take you to a place and the story ends up wrong?
Well, that's happened too, because they've killed so many. It wasn't this place, it was over there. And so that's part of the problem when you get individuals that are killing multiple people and they can't remember because it was 20 years ago. Welcome to a serial killer. And so
right, and there's a big part of just human memory there. Yep. You and I have done this kind of thing, and we're like, well, so I was passing this stop sign, and then a block later is the McDonald's, and there's no McDonald's there because your mind doesn't remember and put those kind of details together. So that doesn't really surprise me at all, I guess.
Right. And it's and but the police do take incredible amounts of time to validate the number of deaths that this individual has done. And many times they'll go out and it's like, Bundy claimed he did over 50 or 100, I don't know. And they weren't able to validate up to maybe 30. Well, but does that mean, he wasn't sure? He was in 5 different states. We just gave the example, well, I thought the McDonald's was at this. Welcome to the human mind.
So, in regards to investigative techniques and databases, sort of this expansion of ways that information like social media could be available to you, or information like DNA, is your expectation that, just assume for a moment, and you can tell me if this is a bad assumption, that sort of the number and the rate of serial killers is relatively stable, sort of in this industrial era. You expect that you're going to see a higher proportion of these people caught, stopped earlier, that kind of thing? Or is that, there's probably trade-offs there, I guess is what I'm thinking about.
Well, again, we have made incredible leaps in police investigations in using this kind of scientific technology. And I believe we're going to get more. The problem is that as we make these advances, these individuals know about it. And so the idea, well, I'm not going to, can I eradicate DNA on a victim? Sure you can. Okay? So what's that going to do? It's going to make the police job extremely harder. So I don't know if we're going to find that there's going to be a substantial increase in the arrests of serial killers. Frankly, I think no, it won't. I think it's going to remain the same, and the serial killers are going to recognize this, and they're going to do everything they can to get rid of any kind of incriminating evidence on that person's body. But what will happen, I believe, is that you will see these cold cases where clothing has been found, where they keep all this in a freezer, and they resurrect it 30 years later, and they're able to find some type of biological evidence that leads to DNA, and then boom, away you go. I think you'll see in many major police departments, Amarillo's doing this right now, cold cases is what they call it. And cold case investigation is coming under a new scrutiny because of the availability of this new technology that's taking crimes that we didn't have, but we may have a shot at evidence that may drive technology to at least locate the ancestry of this DNA, and then away you go. I think you're going to see that coming very strong in the next 3 to 5 years. And the other reason is because the processing of DNA is getting less and less expensive. And so as you look at those kind of things, the probability that the use of DNA in solving many of these cold cases is going to come to reality. And so you may see people who, you may see arrest, but I don't think that's going to have anything to do with our current state of affairs.
We've kind of up to this point not really talked about we talked a little bit about the motivation, but just kind of take for granted there's something broken about serial killers. By definition, you have to get to somewhere abnormal to engage in that kind of behavior. Do you think there are societal causes to that, or are there type of, an isolation or feeling like you don't have people around you, or, having one of the common stories, we've touched on this a little bit, right, is somebody who has an interaction where they harmed an animal early on, and that gave them some of that rush, and then over time they had to kind of graduate to that. But do you see things in society that would make you think we might have a chance to reduce the number of these things, or things that we might worry would cause more serial killers, or is that just kind of genetically aberrational in terms of cause?
Well, that is the $58 billion question, my friend.
Right.
Because right now, between psychologists. They're looking at the idea of bedwetting or arson, playing with matches, killing animals, all this stuff. That's one theory. Another theory is that severe abuse as a baby and a child, and that abuse is physically, sexually, and emotionally. There's another theory out there that most of the serial killers that we discuss had serious head trauma as a young child. A gentleman doing research over in New Mexico that was taking brain scans of serial killers and comparing them to individuals of the same age, gender, and ethnicity to see the differences. So I will say, get your dice out, roll them on the table, and take your pick. There's a lot of people claiming they have the solution as to what makes a serial killer. And we're back to a bunch of factors. And to say this one is going to do it all the time, I would say that's not good. Because you actually, when you do the history and you research these individuals and you trace back, every one of these individuals has, a particular thing that may fit into this category or it may not. And so if you're a psychologist, it's going to fit. Nope, doesn't fit here because you got this. And if you're over here, it's the head trauma. No head trauma. It's because mom was a prostitute and did all these bad things to this kid when they were 3, 4 years. Roll the dice.
So some of the cases of serial killers, you look at the life that they lived up to that point, and there's just no reason. Like, there is no abuse. You can understand the abuse. You can understand the head injury, and yet, you have some like really white collar people living great lives that end up in that. So there's obviously got to be a lot of causes that need to be considered.
Yes,
and probably none of them are going to be the singular cause. I think that's a good point. Always to be made. We make this a lot in economics, but it's true also in psychology. Is you really are better off not underestimating the complexity of the kind of systems that you're dealing with, for the same reasons that economists are saying don't think that you can mess with an economy and get the outcomes you want, because the economies are very, very complex. It's the same with the human mind. Don't think that you're going to turn this dial and push that button and cause human behavior, right? So we're coming up on an hour now, and I kind of had one last topic that I'd like you to weigh in on, which is sort of the history of serial killers. If we think about serial killers, the first name that comes to mind is probably Jack the Ripper, which one of the only serial killers I think of fame that we haven't talked about today. So kind of give us some sense of, and take this where you want to go with it, whether it's the investigative or whether it's the way that media handles it. Give us a sense of some of those cases that are happening before the Ted Bundys and Jeffrey Dahmers.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning Jack. Jack, I have my students and I have investigated Jack for over a decade. I will tell you what I tell my students. There's an author, her name is Patricia Cornwell. She wrote a book, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, Portrait of a Serial Killer. That book has been reviewed, indicted, blasted, all over the place. Here's the key to that book, and you can get it for $2. That gives the reader a very good outline on how to apply forensic science to a murder mystery that started in 1888 and still continues today. And that book shows the extent that this woman, she invested $6 million of her own money. Cornwell actually worked in a medical examiner's office in Richmond, Virginia, and she would type out the results of autopsies. She did over 4,000. This woman knows what she is talking about when it comes to the human body, when it comes to investigations, and that's what I say. And so reading that book will give the reader an idea of applying forensic science, which at that time, she wrote that book in 2001 or 2002. Forensic science has made huge progress since then. So, but I got to hand it to her. She is one of the only authors who have written about Jack the Ripper, and literally there are hundreds, if not thousands, they call them ripperologists, and hundreds, if not thousands of books. But I'm telling you, she has taken that step by step by step by step by step. And as a former police chief and a former police investigator, she's really dissected it. And I would encourage our readers, our listeners, to get that book and read it. Now, did she prove who Jack the Ripper is? $58 gazillion question. What I feel she did is she has provided enough circumstantial evidence to identify one individual, Walter Sickert, who she's identified as Jack the Ripper. Very interesting things about that claim, because Walter Sickert was considered a very famous English painter with Whistler. In fact, he worked with Whistler. Interesting things when you look at that. The thing that interests me, this individual, very famous author, she made this claim in 2001. Her idea is, well, if I'm wrong, they're going to sue me. They haven't sued her yet. Very interesting. Here's another interesting thing about that. Walter Sickert, I believe, was a very smart person. He had multiple things that he did to augment his painting. He was an actor. He married into some very rich families so he could live off that. Married 3 times. You can't find his body because it was cremated. Well, can you find DNA over 100 years? Well, there's some speculation you could. In fact, one of the victims, Mary et al., supposedly had a scarf that was worn when she was killed, and so one of the there's a whole other investigative case going on. Is that, how do you validate that was actually, it was passed on from family to family? You got a lot of problems here. But supposedly there was some DNA on that, and so that DNA came up, and they tried to look at that, and they said, nah, it didn't identify this, it identified that. Total, let's throw the dice again. But the important thing about Jack the Ripper, and we've mentioned this all through the thing, there's sort of a how can I say it, sort of a mystery and a fascination with serial killers. Jack the Ripper has been out there. There's been countless movies, countless things done on that. It's one of those topics that piques the interest of the human mind. And as he's one, serial killers are going to do exactly the same thing, I feel. And that's why we're having a discussion on serial killers. That's where we are.
My guest today has been Harry Hueston. Harry, thank you for joining us on the EconBuff.
Listen, we'll do it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EconBuff. You can find all previous episodes on YouTube at EconBuff Podcast. You can check out our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. That's WIXSIT.com. You can contact us at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.